You're standing in a field somewhere in Virginia. The year is 1862. The air is thick with humidity, and the wool uniform clinging to your body feels like it weighs 100 pounds. You haven't slept properly in 3 days. Your feet are blistered, bleeding, wrapped in rags because your shoes disintegrated 2 weeks ago. The man next to you is shaking, not from fear, though there's plenty of that, but from the dysentery that's been ripping through your regiment like wildfire. He's been to the latrine 12 times since dawn, and the battle hasn't even started yet. You think you know what war is. You've seen the movies. You've played the video games. You've read the books and watched the documentaries. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could prepare you for the sheer, unrelenting nightmare that was serving as a soldier in the American Civil War. This wasn't just a war. This was a 4-year exercise in human suffering, on a scale that most of us today simply cannot comprehend. So, settle in, get comfortable, because over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly why you, yes, you with your modern sensibilities, your antibiotics, your climate-controlled home, and your complete inexperience with watching men die screaming right in front of you, wouldn't last a single day in this conflict. Let's start at the very beginning. Let's say you've somehow been transported back to 1861. The war has just begun. Patriotic fervour is sweeping the nation, both nations really, since you now have to pick a side. The Confederacy is calling for volunteers to defend Southern honour and independence. The Union is calling for volunteers to preserve the Republic and eventually to end the institution of slavery. Young men are flooding recruitment offices, convinced that this will be a short, glorious adventure. They're talking about being home by Christmas. They're talking about honour and duty and proving their manhood. They have absolutely no idea what's coming. Neither do you. The first thing you need to understand is that the American Civil War was the first truly modern war, but it was fought with tactics and medical knowledge that belonged to the Napoleonic era. This mismatch would prove catastrophic. You had rifled muskets capable of accurate fire at ranges of 300 to 400 yards, being used against troops still employing massed infantry charges. You had artillery that could tear men apart from a mile away. You had repeating rifles and early machine guns making their debut. And you had generals on both sides who had studied at West Point, learned Napoleonic tactics, and simply could not adapt quickly enough to the new realities of industrialized warfare. But we'll get to the killing in due time. First, let's talk about what happens before you even see combat. Let's talk about daily life in the army. You've signed up. You've said goodbye to your family, maybe forever, though you don't want to think about that. You've been issued your uniform, your rifle, your kit. You've been assigned to a regiment, probably made up of men from your home state, maybe even your home county. These are your neighbours, your friends, your relatives. You'll fight alongside them, eat with them, sleep with them, and watch many of them die. Your first shock comes with the marching. Civil War armies moved on foot. There were horses for officers and cavalry, mules and wagons for supplies, but the average infantry soldier walked. And when I say walked, I mean walked distances that would make a modern marathon runner weep. It was not unusual for regiments to cover 20 to 30 miles in a single day, sometimes more when circumstances demanded it, and they did this carrying everything they owned. Let's talk about that load. Your rifle weighs about 9 pounds. Your cartridge box, filled with 40 rounds of ammunition, adds another few pounds. Your haversack contains your rations, more on those later, along with personal items like letters from home, a Bible if you're religious, maybe a deck of cards. Your canteen holds about 3 pints of water, which will not be nearly enough. Your blanket roll contains your wool blanket, your rubber blanket, if you're lucky enough to have one, and maybe a spare shirt. Your knapsack holds additional clothing and personal effects. All told, you're carrying somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds of gear, and you're expected to march with it for hours on end, in summer heat that reaches the high 90s with humidity to match, or in winter cold that drops below freezing. And you're doing this in shoes that were probably made by the lowest bidder. This is where we encounter one of the lesser-known horrors of Civil War service: the contractors. Both the Union and Confederate governments were scrambling to equip armies that had expanded far beyond anyone's expectations. And unscrupulous contractors saw an opportunity. Shoes were made with cardboard soles that dissolved in the first rainstorm. Uniforms were sewn with thread that unraveled after a week. Blankets were thin and offered little protection from the elements. Food was rotten, adulterated, or simply absent. Men died because of shoddy equipment as surely as they died from enemy bullets. So there you are, marching through the Virginia mud, and it's always mud. If there's one constant in Civil War accounts, it's the ever-present mud. Your feet blistered and bloody, your shoulders aching from the weight of your pack, your wool uniform soaked with sweat. You've been walking since before dawn, and the sun is now directly overhead. The column stretches out for miles ahead of you and miles behind. Somewhere up front, the officers are on horseback, but you can't see them through the dust cloud kicked up by thousands of shuffling feet. You're thirsty. You drained your canteen hours ago. There's a stream coming up. You can see it on the map. But when you finally reach it, you discover that the regiment ahead of you has been watering their horses in it. And the regiment before that used it as a latrine. And there's a dead mule floating about 50 yards upstream. You fill your canteen anyway. You don't have a choice. This is how you get sick. Here's a statistic that should terrify you. For every soldier who died in combat during the American Civil War, roughly 2 died of disease. The total death toll of the war is estimated at somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 men, depending on which study you consult. That means disease killed somewhere in the neighbourhood of 400,000 to 500,000 soldiers over the course of 4 years. To put that in perspective, that's more Americans than died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined, from disease alone. And the diseases that killed them were, for the most part, entirely preventable. They just didn't know how. The germ theory of disease was still in its infancy in the 1860s. Louis Pasteur was doing his groundbreaking work in France, but his discoveries hadn't yet filtered into common medical practice, and certainly not into military medicine. The doctors of the Civil War era believed in miasma theory, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air, by foul smells, by mysterious vapours rising from swamps and battlefields. They didn't understand bacteria. They didn't understand viruses. They didn't understand that the water they were drinking, the food they were eating, and the hands they were touching were killing them more effectively than enemy rifles. Let's talk about what's going to kill you. Dysentery is the most likely candidate. This catch-all term covered various intestinal infections that caused severe diarrhea, often bloody, accompanied by fever, cramping, and dehydration. It spread through contaminated water and food, through unwashed hands, through flies that landed on feces and then on your dinner. In the close quarters of an army camp, with thousands of men sharing limited latrine facilities, if there were facilities at all, dysentery spread like wildfire. Some regiments reported that half their men were incapacitated by intestinal complaints at any given time. If dysentery doesn't get you, typhoid fever might. Typhoid was another waterborne disease caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi. It caused sustained high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, and rose-coloured spots on the chest. It could last for weeks, and it was often fatal. Typhoid was so common in Civil War camps that soldiers simply expected to get it at some point during their service. Many did. Many never recovered. Then there's malaria. This mosquito-borne disease was endemic in much of the American South, and Union soldiers from northern states had no immunity to it. The symptoms were brutal, alternating episodes of shaking chills and burning fever, sometimes accompanied by vomiting and delirium. Malaria rarely killed outright, but it weakened its victims so severely that they became susceptible to other diseases. A soldier weakened by malaria might survive his first bout, only to succumb to pneumonia, or typhoid, or simple exhaustion. Smallpox, measles, mumps, scarlet fever, tuberculosis, pneumonia. These diseases tore through Civil War armies with terrifying efficiency. Many soldiers, particularly those from rural areas, had never been exposed to common childhood illnesses and had no immunity. When these diseases hit, they hit hard. The measles outbreak that struck Confederate forces in 1861 to 1862 killed an estimated 5,000 men and incapacitated tens of thousands more. And we haven't even talked about the camps themselves. You've survived the march, you've drunk the contaminated water, and somehow haven't developed cholera. Yet. Your regiment has finally reached its destination, the sprawling army camp, home to tens of thousands of men. This will be your home for the foreseeable future, at least until the next march, or the next battle. Looking around, you might be struck by how primitive everything is. The tents stretch out in long rows, each one housing anywhere from 4 to 8 men depending on the size. These are not the modern camping tents you might be imagining. These are canvas A-frames or wedge tents with no floor, no ventilation, and barely enough room to lie down side by side. In summer, they're ovens, trapping heat and humidity until the air inside becomes nearly unbreathable. In winter, they're refrigerators, offering minimal protection from wind and snow. You'll share this space with half a dozen other men, none of whom have bathed in weeks. The smell is indescribable. But the tents are almost luxurious compared to what happens when the army is on campaign. During active operations, soldiers often slept in the open, with nothing but their rubber blanket beneath them and their wool blanket above. If it rained, and it rained frequently, you simply got wet and stayed wet. There was no way to dry your clothes, no way to get warm. You shivered through the night and hoped you wouldn't develop pneumonia. The latrines, euphemistically called sinks, were long trenches dug at the edge of camp. Regulations specified that they should be filled in regularly and new ones dug, that they should be located downstream and downwind from water sources and cooking areas, that lime should be used to control smell and flies. In practice, these regulations were often ignored. Latrines overflowed. Men too sick to walk to the sinks simply relieved themselves wherever they happened to be. Flies bred in the filth and then landed on the food. The connection between sanitation and disease was not understood, and so the same mistakes were made again and again. Speaking of food, let's talk about what you're going to eat. The standard ration for a Union soldier consisted of the following, issued per man per day: 12 ounces of pork or bacon, or 20 ounces of fresh or salt beef, 18 ounces of soft bread or flour, or 12 ounces of hardtack, and various supplementary items issued to groups of soldiers, including beans, rice, coffee, sugar, vinegar, and salt. Confederate rations were similar in theory, but increasingly scarce in practice, as the Union blockade strangled Southern supply lines. This sounds almost reasonable, doesn't it? Meat, bread, beans, coffee. A man could live on that. But theory and practice were very different things. Let's start with the hardtack. This was the bread of the Civil War soldier, and calling it bread is almost criminally generous. Hardtack was a thick cracker made of flour, water, and nothing else. No salt, no leavening, no flavour. It was baked until completely dry, which gave it an almost indefinite shelf life. This was important for logistics. Hardtack could be stored for months or even years without spoiling, but it came at a cost. Hardtack was so hard that soldiers often joked about using it as building material. Many men had to break it apart by smashing it with their rifle butts. Others soaked it in water or coffee until it became soft enough to chew. And if you were lucky, that was all you'd find inside. If you were unlucky, you'd find weevils. The weevil, a small beetle, loved to lay its eggs in stored grain products. By the time hardtack reached the soldiers, it was often infested. Experienced soldiers learned to eat their hardtack in the dark, so they wouldn't have to see what they were eating. Some dunked it in coffee and then skimmed the weevils off the top. Others simply accepted the extra protein. You didn't have a choice. It was eat the weevil-infested hardtack or starve. The meat was often no better. Salt pork and salt beef were preserved with enormous quantities of salt, rendering them almost inedible without extensive soaking and cooking. Fresh meat was available only sporadically, and by the time it reached the common soldier, fresh was often a generous description. Soldiers reported meat that was green, meat that was crawling with maggots, meat that smelled so foul it could be detected from yards away. They ate it anyway. You're probably wondering about vegetables. After all, surely the army provided some source of vitamins beyond meat and bread. The answer is, sometimes. When available, soldiers received beans, peas, rice, and what was optimistically called desiccated vegetables, a brick of dried mixed vegetables that, when boiled, theoretically reconstituted into something edible. Soldiers called it desecrated vegetables, and avoided it when possible. Fresh vegetables were a luxury, available only when foraging parties could acquire them from local farms, or when sutlers, civilian merchants who followed the army, had them for sale at exorbitant prices. The result of this diet was predictable: scurvy. This vitamin C deficiency, more commonly associated with sailors on long voyages, became widespread in Civil War armies. Symptoms included fatigue, swollen and bleeding gums, bruising, joint pain, and eventually, death. Thousands of soldiers developed scurvy, and many died from it. Now I should mention that you could supplement your rations if you had money. Sutlers followed the armies, setting up shop in camps and selling all manner of goods that soldiers craved. Canned fruits and vegetables, pies and cakes, cheese, butter, tobacco, newspapers, writing paper, and countless other items. But sutlers charged premium prices, often marking up goods by 200 or 300%. A private soldier earned $13 a month, and that's if he got paid at all, which was by no means guaranteed. After a few visits to the sutler, that pay was gone. You could also forage, which was a polite way of saying you could steal from local civilians. Armies on both sides engaged in foraging, sometimes with official sanction and sometimes without. Soldiers took chickens, pigs, cattle, vegetables, fruit, anything edible they could find. They burned fences for firewood and tore apart barns for building materials. The line between foraging and looting was often blurry, and civilians in the path of armies, whether friendly or enemy, could expect to be stripped of everything they owned. But foraging required energy, and energy was in short supply. After a long march, most soldiers simply wanted to collapse. And if you were sick, which remember was more likely than not, foraging was out of the question. So you ate your weevil-infested hardtack, your rotten salt pork, your desecrated vegetables. You drank your coffee, which was often the only bright spot in your day. Civil War soldiers were notoriously devoted to their coffee, and the deprivation of it was considered a genuine hardship. And you tried not to think too hard about where your next meal was coming from, because thinking too hard about anything would drive you mad. Here's something the movies don't tell you about war. Most of it is waiting. For every hour of combat, Civil War soldiers endured weeks or months of tedium. They drilled, they marched, they built fortifications, they stood guard, and they waited. They waited for orders, they waited for supplies, they waited for pay, and they waited for something, anything, to break the monotony. A typical day in camp began before dawn, with drums or bugles rousing the men for roll call. Then came breakfast, whatever food you could scrounge up. Cooked over a campfire if you had the energy and fuel. Eaten raw or cold if you didn't. Then drill. Hours of drill. Marching in formation, practicing maneuvers, loading and firing your rifle until the motions became automatic. This was not pointless busy work. The chaos of battle required soldiers who could perform their duties without thinking, whose muscle memory would take over when their conscious minds were paralyzed by terror. But it was tedious beyond belief. After drill came whatever work details you'd been assigned. Building fortifications, digging latrines, cutting firewood, standing picket duty. The list of tasks was endless, and soldiers were kept busy from dawn to dusk. Only after evening roll call and supper were men free to pursue their own activities, and by then, Most were too exhausted to do anything but sleep. In their limited free time, soldiers wrote letters home. They were prolific correspondents, these Civil War soldiers, and their letters provide much of what we know about the experience of common soldiers. They wrote to wives and parents and children, to sweethearts and friends and siblings. They described their daily lives in meticulous detail, complained about the food and the weather and their officers, asked for news from home, and assured their loved ones that they were well, even when they weren't, even when they were dying. They played games. Cards were popular, particularly poker and euchre, despite official disapproval from chaplains who considered gambling immoral. They played chess and checkers and dominoes. They organised baseball games, foot races, and wrestling matches. They sang songs around the campfire, sentimental ballads about home and sweethearts and the loved ones they might never see again. And they fought boredom with a desperation that's hard for modern people to understand. There was no radio, no television, no internet, no movies, no video games. Books were available but in limited supply. Newspapers were eagerly sought after and passed from hand to hand until they fell apart. For entertainment, soldiers had each other, and that was about it. The psychological toll of this enforced idleness was immense. Soldiers had too much time to think, too much time to dwell on the friends they'd seen killed, too much time to wonder if they'd be next. They developed what was then called nostalgia, a profound homesickness that could progress to depression, withdrawal, and sometimes death. Modern researchers would probably diagnose many of these men with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or anxiety. But such diagnoses didn't exist in the 1860s. A soldier who couldn't function was considered a coward or a malingerer. There was no sympathy, no treatment, no understanding. Alcohol offered temporary relief, and soldiers pursued it with enthusiasm. Despite official regulations prohibiting the sale of liquor to enlisted men, whiskey was readily available, from sutlers, local civilians, and enterprising comrades who knew how to distill their own. Officers looked the other way, partly because they were often drinking themselves, and partly because a drunk soldier was a quiet soldier. The army ran on coffee and whiskey, and anyone who tried to interfere with either was inviting trouble. Religion provided comfort for some. Both armies included chaplains, and religious services were well attended, particularly before battles. Soldiers read their Bibles, prayed for deliverance, and tried to make peace with the possibility of death. Revivals swept through camps, particularly in the Confederate Army, with thousands of soldiers undergoing conversion experiences. Whether these conversions were sincere or merely hedges against the uncertainty of the afterlife is impossible to say, but they offered something that the army otherwise lacked: hope. But even hope had its limits. As the war dragged on, as casualties mounted, as the initial enthusiasm gave way to grim endurance, many soldiers simply stopped believing that they would survive. They became fatalists, convinced that their death was inevitable and that nothing they did could prevent it. This fatalism could be paralyzing, but it could also be liberating. If death was certain, then there was no point in being afraid. You simply did what you had to do, and waited for the bullet with your name on it. And then, finally, after weeks or months of waiting, the orders came. The enemy had been located. The army was moving out. Battle was imminent. This is the part you've been waiting for, and dreading. The march to battle was unlike any other march. Every man knew that within hours he might be dead. The jokes and complaints that normally filled the ranks fell silent. Men checked and rechecked their rifles, made sure their cartridge boxes were full, wrote hasty letters to be sent home if they fell. Some prayed openly. Others stared straight ahead with the blank expression of men trying very hard not to think. The sounds came first. Artillery, booming in the distance, getting louder as you approached. Then small arms fire, the crackling roar of thousands of rifles that sounded almost like continuous thunder. Then screaming, whether from men or horses or simply the chaos of battle you couldn't tell. And then you crested a rise and saw the battlefield for the first time. Nothing could have prepared you for this. Smoke covered everything, thick and white, and acrid, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. Somewhere in that smoke, thousands of men were trying to kill each other. You could see muzzle flashes, brief and bright, appearing and disappearing like fireflies. You could see flags, regimental colours, national colours, the sacred emblems that men died to protect, waving above the chaos. You could see bodies too, scattered across the ground, some still moving, most not. The smell hit you next. Gunpowder, sharp and chemical. Smoke, blood, metallic and warm. Excrement, because dying men voided their bowels. And something else, something sweet and cloying. The smell of exposed viscera. The smell you would never forget as long as you lived. Your regiment was forming into line. Officers were shouting orders, trying to make themselves heard above the din. You took your place, shoulder to shoulder with the man next to you, just as you'd practiced 1,000 times in drill. But drill hadn't included the bullets whipping past your head, the screaming, the blood. Drill hadn't included the man 3 places to your right, suddenly collapsing with a hole in his chest. And then the order came. Fix bayonets. Your hands were shaking as you attached the long blade to the end of your rifle. The bayonet had a grim utility. It turned your rifle into a spear, useful for when things got too close for shooting. But you knew what fixing bayonets really meant. It meant your officers expected hand-to-hand combat. It meant you'd be close enough to the enemy to see their faces, close enough to smell their breath, close enough to feel the resistance as your bayonet slid into their flesh.
Let's talk about what's about to happen to you. You're walking forward into a wall of bullets. That's really the only way to describe it. Civil War rifles were capable of firing 2 to 3 rounds per minute in the hands of a trained soldier, and there are thousands of enemy soldiers in front of you. The mathematics are not in your favour. Every step you take increases your chances of being hit, and yet you keep walking, because the men around you are walking, because your officers are walking, because to run would mean dishonour worse than death. The bullets make strange sounds. Some whistle, some snap, some buzz like angry insects. When they hit flesh, they make a thudding sound, like someone punching a side of beef. You hear that sound a lot. Men are falling all around you. Some screaming, some silent, some clawing at the ground as they try to crawl away. You're supposed to be shooting back. That's why you're here after all. But your hands are shaking so badly you can barely load your rifle. You bite open a paper cartridge, pour the powder down the barrel, seat the ball, ram it home, place the percussion cap on the nipple, raise the rifle, aim at what? You can't see anything but smoke, and fire. The kick bruises your shoulder, the smoke blinds you, and you have no idea if you hit anything. Reload, fire, reload, fire. The motions become mechanical, just as they did in drill, but everything else is wrong. In drill, no one was shooting back. In drill, the man next to you didn't suddenly spray you with blood from a severed artery. In drill, you couldn't hear the screams of the wounded, begging for water, begging for their mothers, begging for someone to kill them and end the pain. Let's talk about what those bullets are doing to the human body. Civil War rifles fired a conical lead bullet called the Minier ball, typically .58 caliber, weighing about an ounce. This bullet was soft, pure lead, designed to expand upon firing to grip the rifling of the barrel, and it caused catastrophic wounds. When a Minier ball hit soft tissue, it mushroomed, creating an exit wound far larger than the entrance wound. When it hit bone, the bone didn't just break, it shattered. The bullet would carry bone fragments deep into the surrounding tissue, creating wounds that were essentially impossible to clean. And this is why Civil War medicine was so brutal. A surgeon confronted with a shattered arm or leg had exactly one option: amputation. There was no way to repair the damage, no way to clean the wound effectively, no antibiotics to prevent infection. If the limb wasn't removed, gangrene would set in within days, and gangrene was a death sentence, so the surgeons amputated. By some estimates, Civil War surgeons performed over 60,000 amputations over the course of the war. They became extraordinarily skilled at it. A good surgeon could remove a leg in under 2 minutes, but speed didn't make the experience any less horrific for the patient. Anesthesia existed, thankfully. Chloroform and ether were used in the vast majority of surgeries, despite what lost cause mythology would have you believe about soldiers biting bullets. but anesthesia only dulled the pain. It didn't eliminate it entirely, and it wore off quickly. The patient would wake to find himself missing a limb, facing weeks of recovery in a field hospital that was little more than a charnel house. And many didn't wake at all. Surgical mortality was high, somewhere between 25 and 40% for major amputations, and even those who survived the surgery often died later of infection. The surgeons didn't sterilize their instruments. They didn't wash their hands. They didn't understand germ theory. They would operate on one patient, wipe their sore on their apron, and move on to the next. They called the pus that oozed from wounds laudable pus, and considered it a sign of healing. It was, in fact, a sign of infection. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You're still on the battlefield, still walking forward into that wall of bullets, and the surgeons are far away. The distance between the lines is closing. 50 yards, 40, 30. The smoke is so thick you can barely breathe, let alone see. Shapes loom out of the murk. Are they friend or foe? You don't know until they're right in front of you, and then they are. The enemy line materializes out of the smoke, close enough to touch, and for a moment, everything stops. You can see their faces. They're young, most of them, younger than you expected. They're dirty and haggard and terrified, and you realize with a shock that they look exactly like your own men. They look exactly like you. Then someone screams, maybe on your side, maybe on theirs, and the lines crash together. This is where the bayonets come in. Hand-to-hand combat in the Civil War was rare, but when it happened, it was unimaginably brutal. Men fought with bayonets, with rifle butts, with fists and teeth. They gouged eyes. They bit off ears. They killed men whose faces they could see, whose breath they could feel, whose dying screams they would hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Most people couldn't do it. That's the dirty secret of close combat. Most people, when the moment comes, simply cannot bring themselves to kill another human being at close range. Studies of military combat have consistently found that a significant percentage of soldiers, some estimates run as high as 50% or more, never fire their weapons in combat, or fire them over the enemy's heads, or find some other way to avoid taking a life. The psychological barriers against killing are strong, and overcoming them requires training that the Civil War armies simply didn't provide. But some men could do it. Some men found that they had a talent for killing, a capacity for violence that they hadn't known existed. Some men discovered that they enjoyed it. War unleashed something dark in the human psyche, something that civilization had spent millennia trying to suppress. And once unleashed, it was hard to put back in the bottle. The melee lasted only minutes, though it felt like hours. Eventually, one side or the other broke. Maybe it was you, scrambling backward over the bodies, trying to put distance between yourself and the slaughter. Maybe it was them, retreating into the smoke from which they'd emerged. Either way, the immediate crisis passed, and you found yourself still alive, still standing, covered in blood that might or might not be your own. The battle wasn't over. Battles rarely ended so cleanly, but this phase of it was done, and you had survived. For now.
The fighting has moved elsewhere. The sound of gunfire and artillery is distant now, a rumble on the horizon rather than an immediate threat. But the battlefield around you is anything but peaceful. The wounded are everywhere. They lie in windows where the lines clashed, stacked atop each other like cordwood. They crawl toward imagined safety, trailing blood behind them. They prop themselves against trees and fences, clutching at wounds that no one will treat for hours, maybe days. Some cry out for help, for water, for their mothers. Others are silent, conserving their strength or simply too far gone to speak, and you can do nothing for them. This is one of the hardest realities of Civil War combat. After a battle, the wounded often lay on the field for days. Medical care was primitive, understaffed, and overwhelmed. Ambulance corps, when they existed at all, prioritized cases they thought they could save, which meant that men with serious wounds were often left to die where they fell. The dead weren't buried immediately either. After major battles, bodies would lie in the open for days, bloating and blackening in the sun, filling the air with a stench that veterans described as indescribable. If you were wounded, your chances of survival depended on several factors: the nature of your wound, how quickly you received treatment, and pure dumb luck. A wound to the extremities was survivable, usually, assuming you got to a surgeon before gangrene set in. You'd lose the limb, but you'd live. A wound to the torso was another matter. Abdominal wounds were almost universally fatal. Even if you survived the initial trauma, peritonitis would kill you within days. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. Chest wounds were only slightly better. A bullet that missed the heart and major vessels might allow you to survive. But if it hit the lungs, you'd drown in your own blood. Head wounds were, paradoxically, sometimes the most survivable of severe wounds, if you survived the initial impact. The brain is remarkably resilient, and men lived through injuries that seem impossible by modern standards. But those who survived often faced a lifetime of disability, paralysis, seizures, blindness, psychological changes that their families barely recognized. And then there were the wounds that didn't immediately incapacitate. A ball through the hand or foot, a graze across the scalp, a bayonet wound to the arm. Men with these injuries often kept fighting, either because they didn't realize they'd been hit, or because they knew that leaving the line meant abandoning their comrades. Those who survived the journey faced overcrowded wards, understaffed nurses, and the ever-present risk of hospital-acquired infections. Some men recovered, against all odds. Despite the primitive conditions and the lack of understanding of basic hygiene, some men survived their wounds and returned to duty. Others were discharged, sent home with missing limbs or chronic conditions that would plague them for the rest of their lives. And many, too many, were buried in unmarked graves far from home, their families never knowing for certain what had happened to them. Let's step back for a moment and talk about the sheer scale of death in the American Civil War. The total number of military deaths is estimated at somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000, depending on which methodology you use. The lower figure comes from traditional estimates based on military records. The higher figure comes from more recent demographic studies that attempt to account for deaths that were never officially recorded. Either way, the Civil War killed more Americans than every other American war combined, before or since. But raw numbers don't really capture the magnitude of the loss. Let's think about it proportionally. The population of the United States in 1860 was approximately 31 million. If we take the middle estimate of about 700,000 deaths, that means roughly 2.3% of the entire population died in the war. For comparison, the equivalent today would be about 7.5 million deaths. Imagine a war that killed 7.5 million Americans. Imagine the impact that would have on our society, our economy, our national psyche. But even that comparison doesn't fully capture it, because the deaths were not evenly distributed. Nearly all of them were young men. Entire generations were decimated. Some communities lost virtually all of their military-age males. The South, with its smaller population, suffered proportionally more. Perhaps 1 in 4 white Southern men of military age died in the war. In some Southern states, the figure was closer to 1 in 3. The demographic consequences were felt for decades. Women who lost husbands and potential husbands never married. Children grew up without fathers. The labour force was permanently reduced, slowing economic recovery. And the psychological impact, the collective trauma of a society that had lost so many of its young men, shaped American culture for generations. Let me give you some specific battles to illustrate the carnage. Antietam, September 17, 1862. This single day of combat remains the bloodiest day in American history. The combined casualties, killed, wounded and missing, numbered approximately 23,000. That's more than the total American casualties on D-Day, in 12 hours. Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd, 1863. Over 3 days of fighting, the two armies suffered approximately 51,000 casualties combined. The town of Gettysburg had a population of about 2,400. Suddenly, it had over 21,000 wounded men to care for, and over 7,000 dead to bury. The Wilderness, May 5th to 7th, 1864. This battle was fought in dense forest, where neither side could see or maneuver effectively. The woods caught fire from the muzzle flashes, and wounded men burned to death where they lay, unable to crawl to safety. The screams of the burning men haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Cold Harbor, June 3, 1864. Grant ordered a frontal assault on entrenched Confederate positions. In less than an hour, approximately 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. The attack accomplished nothing. Grant later wrote that it was the one assault he regretted ordering. These were not anomalies. These were typical. Battle after battle produced casualty figures that seem almost unbelievable. Yet they were confirmed by after-action reports, by hospital records, by the letters of soldiers who witnessed the carnage. By now, you might be wondering if anyone actually survived this war. The answer is yes, obviously. Hundreds of thousands of men served and lived to tell about it. But survival is a relative term. Let's talk about what survival looked like. If you made it through the war without serious physical injury, you were lucky. But that didn't mean you escaped unscathed. The psychological toll of combat, what we would now recognize as PTSD, affected virtually everyone who experienced it. Veterans returned home with what their families called the 1,000-yard stare, unable to connect with loved ones, unable to resume normal life. They startled at loud noises, they had nightmares, they drank heavily. Some took their own lives at elevated rates. The term used at the time was soldier's heart or irritable heart. Doctors noticed that many veterans presented with rapid pulse, anxiety, shortness of breath, and chest pain. But they attributed these symptoms to physical causes, to the heart being damaged by the exertion of military life. We now understand that these were symptoms of psychological trauma, of a nervous system that had been overwhelmed by horror and could not return to baseline. There was no treatment. There was barely any recognition that treatment might be needed. Soldiers were expected to go home, pick up their lives, and get on with things. Those who couldn't were considered weak, defective, failures. Many ended up in mental institutions, diagnosed with vague conditions like dementia or mania. Others lived out their lives in quiet suffering, never speaking about what they had seen, carrying the weight until it destroyed them from within. Those who survived with physical injuries faced their own challenges. The hundreds of thousands of amputees had to learn to live without arms or legs in a society that offered few accommodations for the disabled. Prosthetics were available, but primitive. Wooden legs, hook hands, devices that were better than nothing but far from ideal. Many men couldn't work, couldn't support their families, couldn't do the physical labor that had sustained them before the war. Pensions were available, for Union veterans at least. The Confederate government had ceased to exist, and the states of the former Confederacy were too impoverished to provide much assistance. Union veterans could apply for pensions based on their disabilities, but the application process was bureaucratic and often adversarial. Many men found their claims denied or reduced. Those who did receive pensions often found them inadequate to cover their needs. Veterans organizations provided some support. The Grand Army of the Republic for Union veterans and the United Confederate Veterans for Confederate veterans served as social clubs, mutual aid societies, and political lobbying groups. They held reunions, built monuments, and worked to shape the memory of the war. But they couldn't undo the damage that had been done.